want to welcome everybody to tonight's RennCast here on YouTube. And tonight we have a really cool topic, IMS bearing service intervals. Before we get to that, I just want to bring up a few things that I noticed on RennList today. Our man from Ellen Engineering, Oliver, has been trying his best to talk to some of these guys, Jake. By the way, I'm here with Jake Raby, Flat Six Innovations, and Oliver has really been trying hard to get information across on RennList. And today on that factory short block thread, well, let me just say, it gets interesting, Jake.
Man,
today
tell
they
you,
were talking about the need for bearing clearances and the whole difference between someone that just assembles an engine and someone that's a true engine builder. So I figured, heck, let's start off, and maybe you, from your perspective, can you explain the differences between someone that builds engines and someone that just assembles them?
well, Bobby, I'm going to tell you, man. Nothing on RennList makes any sense. Everybody wants to hear what they want to hear. They don't want to hear the things that they really need to hear. That's why I left the place. And it's that way with all forums. It's that way with all the Facebook groups. It's even that way when I have hands-on and online classes. People want to hear what they want to hear. They don't want to hear that things are more difficult than they think they are. And then at the end of the day, you got people that think that all these engines are created equally. They're like, oh, okay, a 4-liter engine is a 4-liter engine. Doesn't matter if Flat Six built it, or somebody in another country built it, or somebody on the other side of this country built it, or somebody built it in their garage, or somebody built it on the side of a racetrack. They think that it's all the same because it's the same size, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Then, you see people who they build something and then it breaks. And they're like, oh, I don't know what happened. Well, the reason why they don't know what happened is because they didn't know what they didn't know to begin with. And that's why the classes that I've instructed since 2008 have been so crucial in training professionals and enthusiasts alike, because I break that down and I make it where it's reality. Okay. And, when I was talking to Oliver, and that guy, he's really picked up a lot in a year. I mean, he's been going back and forth as the liaison between Flat Six and LN through this whole merger. And he's picked up a ton. He comes and stays here with me for a while. He goes to the main shop in Cleveland for a while. He goes to LN. He's really picked up on a lot because he has a lot of other experience in the automotive industry. So it's pretty easy. He's a sponge. I'm able to tell him things, and he takes notes all the time. He has this little green book that he carries, and he calls it his green brain, and he writes everything down in this book. And the guy doesn't forget anything. So at the end of the day, and I told him, I'm like, man, leave that alone. There's no good deed goes unpunished on those forums. People, if you don't tell them what they want to hear, they're just going to make you the bad guy. And then, of course, they bring the whole thing up like, well, and I love it when this happens, right? Well, you think you're the only one that can build these engines. No, I know I'm the only one that can build this engine my way. There may be 10 million other ways to do it, but I know that I'm the only one that can put this damn thing together my way. And the reason why you don't find our engines failing on these threads, and you find other engines failing that are built by other people, is because those engines are assembled and they're not built. And I think that's what Oliver was trying to get across, is you can't just take stuff out of a box and put it together and expect to get an exceptional result. People all the time wonder what blueprinting an engine is. It's not a set of blueprints like it is for a house. Blueprinting an engine basically means you're going to take all the critical things that are inside that engine, and you're not going to accept what they are out of the box. One, you're not going to assume they're correct, because engine builders assume nothing and quantify everything. That's the first thing I teach people in my hands-on classes. Assemblers assume everything and quantify nothing because they don't have precision measuring equipment. They don't have the know-how. And the thing is, sometimes guys can get that right. Sometimes you get lucky and you end up with something that has got the proper clearances, and you can put it together basically like a mule wearing blinders, and it's okay. But that's the difference to me between an assembler and a builder. An assembler just bolts it together because that's all he knows how to do. He doesn't have equipment to balance. He doesn't have equipment to cam profile. He doesn't have equipment to flow test cylinder heads. He doesn't have precision measuring equipment. So he's going to do the best he can with what he's got. That's okay for a guy working in his garage. And it's going to be okay for most people. At the end of the day, do you want an exceptional result or do you want an okay result? If you want an exceptional result, you better start buying precision measuring tools, and you better start understanding how to measure down to 1/100th of a thousandth, and understand what clearances are. Now, there's a problem with these engines, and that problem was designed by the factory. And that problem is that none of the specifications within this engine have ever been published. They're not published anywhere within any of the factory manuals. So we have to come up and we have to get that empirically, which means we have to take apart engines. We have to measure them. I brought brand new engines and taken them apart and saw what the clearances were. And guess what? Half the time, the clearances were everywhere and they were too tight. Okay. So people wonder why, these engines have a problem when they go to the track. Lost a number 6 rod bearing, whatever. Well, it lost a number 6 rod bearing probably because the number 1 main bearing clearance was too tight. And maybe the person, if they did measure it, measured it in the 3 to 9 axis, but they didn't measure it basically in the 2 to 7 axis. So, it might be fine 3 to 9, but is that clearance actually round? If you just measure it one plane, one axis, and you get a good number, then you assume that's the number that it is. No, you assume that's not it. And you go in 2 to 3 different axes and you measure different places. So I was just doing that last week. So there's some new main bearings out there on the market. A couple of different companies have started making them now. Genuine is not the only choice. So I took my MC1 and my SF1, which are setting fixtures and measuring centers, and I started measuring these main bearings and rod bearings inside of standards and inside of actual crankshaft carriers, inside of connecting rods. And I was doing this for LA, and that's one of the things with my role here now is anytime something new comes to the market, I'm the guy that's testing it, I'm developing it, I'm checking it, right? That's what I do. So I was able to measure that. And the difference between the 3 to 9 measurement on the genuine bearings versus a 2 to 7 was basically, or actually it's 2 to 8 that I was measuring there. But you're talking 1/1000th and a half of clearance. It was tighter one way than it was the other. So if that engine would have gone together and somebody measured it 3 to 9, and that's the only thing they measured, they'd think it's okay. But you go to the other axis and it's too tight. So as long as one axis is too tight, doesn't matter if one's open or not. If it's too tight in one place, it's too tight all over, is the way you have to look at it. So there's ways to correct that. You can line hone the carriers. I know Oliver, I think he was mentioning that today. So there's things that can be done. These engines have changed over the last 5 years because now they have real time on them. They have real miles on them. And sometimes it's not the miles that do this, just time and service. Things move. Things don't stay the way they were. You've also got engines now that have been rebuilt by other people. And, they may have mismatched parts in them. They're not all virgins anymore, right? So one of the questions in the LNFSI program is, has your engine been rebuilt before? If so, by whom? If it's been rebuilt before, automatic disqualification. We're not going to take that as a core. Doesn't matter who built it. We don't want it as a core. We only want virgins. Because of that, we don't want there to be drama when we sell an engine to somebody. We want it to be a nice, straightforward transaction. And of course, I'm sure at some point somebody's going to turn an engine in that they didn't know had been rebuilt, and we're going to find out that a hack put it together and he was an assembler, not a builder, and it's all screwed up. And we're going to lose our shirt. But at the end of the day, we're trying to avoid that. So the difference between an assembler and a builder is an assembler puts together what is in front of him. A builder doesn't take that for what it is. A builder is going to measure all of the things and put them the way he wants them to be. And that comes from here, and it comes from experience. Just like camshaft timing. I don't even use factory camshaft timing when I put these engines together. The factory tools for camshaft timing are only used here for us to have a baseline to start with camshaft timing. From there, I break out another set of tools, and I treat these engines like they're something else. And then I've got dial indicators and all the things that we use to get the valve timing done our way. And that's why we make power other people don't make. So, I think if everybody is thinking the same way, somebody isn't thinking. And if everybody is assuming that the factory knows best, then somebody hasn't learned any better than that. I don't like anything the factory does.
Well, I'll just jump in here and say, and this is kind of a small example, but when you're talking, I'm a do-it-yourselfer. I am no engine builder. And but I like to save money. So I've done quite a bit of jobs on my cars. And I can remember the last job that I did involved a micro switch on my daughter's Volvo. I went to the dealership, went to the service center that I've dealt with for years. And, I took the part that was in question to him and showed him where the micro switch inside the lock assembly was malfunctioning. And he gave me a new one, which was completely revised, and instructions on how to install it. Now, it's almost like if I was a assembler, I would just follow those instructions 1, 2, 3, 4. And I did. And guess what? It didn't work. So I was like, what the heck? I followed the instructions that told me to do this, do that, do this, do that. I wasn't thinking outside the box. So I was ready to jerk it out. After jerking it out like 5 times, I was ready to take it back to the dealership. I said, what in the world is going on with this thing? So it really took, honestly, just in my opinion, just common sense, looking at how that thing is aligned in the car. And if you just bolt it on, it's not seating, it was not triggering that micro switch. Now, just a little bit of an adjustment, it finally got it. But if I had just followed the instructions, just one, put it here, one, do this, one, do that, one, do that, I'd have been there all day long.
But see,
I
that's
had
the
to kind of
world.
think outside the box a little bit.
But see, that's the world we're in today, where people don't have to think for themselves. You don't have to remember phone numbers anymore. You don't have to remember directions. You don't have to even think for yourself. This is a problem that we have because everybody walks around like this constantly because you've got something doing your thinking for you. And, people can open up YouTube, they can open up Google, whatever, and they get answers. They don't have to think. And I believe this is a major problem that is going to lead to stupidity because people have forgotten how to think. They've forgotten how to improvise. They've forgotten how to problem solve because they have a lifeline. So, an example of that, we have some rental properties and we had a younger couple. I say they're younger, probably 25 or so. And they had rented a home from us. And the guy calls at like 10 o'clock at night. He says, oh my goodness, the thing fell off of the shower and I can't turn the water off. I'm like, what thing? Well, the thing. And I'm like, okay. So I drive up there. It's 10 o'clock at night. Water's running. And the screw had just came out of the center of the faucet. And so I grab it out of the tub and I go to put it in. He's like, oh my God, I didn't know what that thingy was. What thingy? Okay. And he's talking about the screw. And I said, okay, well, this retains this. And, I took my Leatherman tool out and I whipped it back together and it's all fine. He's like, man, he goes, where in the world did you learn how to do all this stuff? I said, dude, I grew up in the mountains. Okay. We had one plumber. Okay. One plumber for the entire county. He was a drunk. He had no driver's license and he had no telephone. Okay. So if you needed him, you had to go to his house. And usually he was either passed out or somebody else that came and picked him up because he couldn't drive. So at the end of the day, you had to do things yourself. So I learned as a kid, yeah, we didn't call somebody. There was nobody to call. So, but that's a classic example. I mean, I can't
Oh
believe the
yeah.
guy didn't just Google it himself and YouTube it and try to figure out how to put the thingy back on the faucet. But
Oh
this
yeah.
is a major problem, and this
Yeah.
is
And
one reason
Porsche
I
is
love.
really bad about the instructions.
Yeah,
Another hot topic, not to get off on it too much, but it's the new PCC M radios, Porsche Classic Communications Management Plus radios they're putting in these cars. If you really get
you
into fancy radios and
you
old
you
Porsches,
you've got a
uh,
6-cylinder orchestra behind you. Take the freaking radio and throw the son of a bitch in the swamp. You don't
I
need
try
it.
to help so many people, and you got to understand the difference between the old analog cars and the most base cars. And I've dealt with them, and I've installed several systems in my Porsches, and you're gonna. If you, the problem is that when they send you that unit, they give you virtually no instructions. And what little instructions you give, if you go by there, you'll end up in trouble every time. You've got to really know how these systems communicate with the car on the digital systems of both space. And so you really have to have a lot of prerequisite knowledge when you're installing this kind of thing. You can't just, like you say, assemble it. So many people are buying it because they don't want to pay a Porsche, which holds probably a lot of the information on how to install it on their own system. So a lot of these people just working blind. But you really have to have prerequisite knowledge before you get into that kind of thing because it's not easy, especially have the old analog cars. So it's kind of like if what little instructions they give you, if you follow it, I mean, you install a thing, you connect here, you connect this line, you connect this line, and then lo and behold, they come on red list. I get sound for about 5 seconds and it goes off.
Yeah,
It's,
I mean, we could have a whole
I know,
RennCast
I
about
know.
when Tony Callis and I do hands-on classes together, we get off on these tangents about people that just don't pay attention. They take things apart and they don't pay attention to how it comes apart. Then they wonder why they can't put it back together again. When you take something apart, you need to take it apart from a perspective of you have no help, you have no YouTube, you have no lifeline, and it's up to you to take it apart and put it back together with no help. If you do it that way, you're going to take all the photos you need, you're going to create your own reference material, you're going to have your own resource pile, and you'll be able to be successful. But if you just zip the thing apart and you're worried about going on your social media and making posts about this cool stuff that you're doing, then you're not paying attention to it. And you're going to pay the price for that because at the end of the day, there's something in that pile that you took apart that nobody else can help you with. And if the one person can help you with it, it's probably sick of dealing with folks like you, and he's not going to help you. So at the end of the day, that's kind of the modern way with most everything. But if you take things apart and you pay attention to it, like you will never have any help, you're okay. You're talking about do it yourself, or I do everything myself. The building that I'm in right now, I built it from scratch myself.
Yeah.
I don't pay people to do anything. So, and don't get me wrong, I screw up a lot of stuff. I mess up a lot of stuff.
And I'm about to
Um,
say, a lot of the stuff that we put in the M9X, engine assembly series, it's just not going to be found in the shop manuals. A lot of the things that you do
None
with
of
the
it.
bearing
None of it.
sleeve and a lot of the things to clear
If
the
you
oil
if
passages.
somebody takes a factory manual and puts this engine together, they will have a problem. If that's the only reference material they use, they will have several problems. I've never known any one individual that was able to do it. And the reason why is because things got left out of translation. It's not just the manual for this engine. Years ago, the first time I did a 996 turbo engine, I hadn't done one. So I used the factory manual as much as I could. And come to find out, the cam timing tools were marked wrong. The actual tools themselves were marked wrong from the factory. They were wrong. And then the manual, the text about how to do the cam timing was wrong. And the pictures that showed how to do the cam timing was a 100% direct inversion of what the text was. Now, luckily, I took my cam timing tools and I fit them to the engine before I took it apart, because I was looking at it like I didn't have any help, and there was no help. So I learned that I couldn't even put the tools in the engine the way the engine was running. So then I'm like, hold on a minute. Are these tools right? Because it's the same tool for GT3 and turbo, but they have different inserts you put into them. The actual tool itself is the same, but there's a GT3 and there's a turbo insert. So I start looking, and they got bank 1 intake marked for bank 2 exhaust. And I'm like, what the hell? So I was able to figure this out before I took the engine apart. Had I not done that, and had I not questioned everything while I was doing it, I would have taken the whole thing apart. I would have tried to use those instructions, which were wrong in every way, and I would have tried to use tools that were wrong in every way. And then I wouldn't have known what to do. But I was able, luckily, God had his hand on my shoulder saying, check this, right? And I don't even know why I did it, because most of the time I wouldn't even do that. But something told me, check those tools. And they were brand new, ordered them straight from the dealer. So that's a good example how everything can be wrong in one of these manuals. And that was the turbo manual.
Oh, and
So
I did the same
illustration's wrong. Illustration's wrong. It's a direct conflict with the text. And then the tools are wrong. What else could be wrong? Nothing. That's everything. Everything is wrong. But luckily, it was so wrong that there's no way you could put it together.
Oh,
because
yeah.
it was so wrong. A worst case scenario is it's just wrong enough that it'll let it bolt together. And then you go to start it up and you got a big problem. See? So anyway, the difference between a builder and an assembler is an assembler doesn't know enough about what can get him in trouble to check everything. And he doesn't have all the tools. He doesn't have all the experience. He hasn't blown enough stuff up. He's going to rely on YouTube. He's going to rely on these things. And he bolts together a box of stuff that works, hopefully. And most of the time it will. But at the end of the day, that engine, if it gets to a point where bearing clearance is a little too tight and it's on the track, it's probably going to pop, because that clearance is one of the major things that leads to failure with these on the track. And this is something that people just don't want to understand. Where the builder, who assumes that everything is wrong, is going to check that clearance. He's going to measure that clearance in different axes. He's going to set that clearance because he has a line hone over here next to him, and he has the ability to use that machine. And he's going to move the bearings from position to position, and he's going to find the bearings that fit the right part of the carrier. You know, every one of the tunnels will have a little bit of a different measurement. Every bearing is a little bit thick or thin. So I use a tube mic to measure the thickness of my bearing shells. Then I use a bore gauge to go inside and see which of those main journal saddles is the biggest or the thinnest or the smallest. So then I want to put the shell that is the thickest goes on the journal or the saddle that is basically the biggest. That gives me the best clearance. So you're able to move these things in different positions, just like when we balance something. If you're a gram out on the piston weights, sometimes you can toss the wrist pins between pistons, and you find one wrist pin that's a little bit lighter or a little bit heavier, and you put that with a piston that's a little lighter or a little heavier, and you can toss those pins back and forth, and you will get your balance tolerance within spec without even removing material. Ava, my daughter's been doing that since she was 5. I got pictures of her balancing pistons when she's 5 years old by swapping the pins and weighing everything out. So
explain in just a nutshell why balancing the internal components is so important. Why a lot of shops don't even consider dynamic balancing.
Yeah, that's another whole that's another whole RennCast, Bobby. I mean, you know, we can't even touch on that in what we've got tonight. We need to get on our service intervals because I'm telling you, you know, it's a hot topic and people just don't understand it.
Okay.
You
Well,
know,
that will be a
because
good topic for next time.
yeah. So anyway, I'm glad you brought that stuff up, but these forums and stuff is a losing battle, you know. And don't get me wrong, I've learned stuff on these forums too. You do learn things from time to time. Not
Yeah, you
everybody
were
on
on
there
a
is an
lot of
idiot.
forums at one time too, because I
Yeah,
know
I
that
mean, I
you
was
were
on
on the
forums since
914 and 986 forums and over the
well, I
years.
mean, I was on Shop Talk forums in 1998 or something like that. I mean, when it went from, and before that, I was in news groups. You know, we were on the old Yahoo stuff, and you know there was one called Ramva, which was was a Volkswagen thing. RAMVWA is what it was. That was a great thing, but people were different back then, man. It was a whole different world. People respected others that had next level knowledge and experience. Today, it's exactly opposite. The majority of these people only want to watch people on YouTube who are as naive as they are and as inexperienced as they are doing the things that they want to do. They end up with a hero because he doesn't know anything and he was able to build this engine. That's their hero. You know, at the end of the day, and I've told you this, Bobby, a guy would on YouTube or one of these forums would much rather watch you take a bunch of pieces that you bought and put together an engine successfully, even if you can't teach him anything, over watching me do it and give them every single silver bullet that I know. That's just the way that it is because they look at that other person as their peer. He knows just as little as they do, and they want to see him succeed. With me, they just want to see me freaking crash and burn. That's all they care about. So, and that's the society we live in. But it was not that way in the old news groups. It wasn't that way when forums first came around. You know, what the information superhighway has done has basically disrespected next level knowledge, and it's made people think that they're entitled to it. You know, this whole open source thing. You know, I'm entitled to that. You know, it posted online. No, just like the specifications that I'm doing for these engines. You know, that was brought up on the forums today, I guess, with what Oliver was saying. But I'm not giving that stuff away. Do you think I busted my knuckles and I've sat here and bought tens of thousands of dollars worth of precision measuring equipment? I spent $7,000 in the last 3 months on precision measuring equipment to update my stuff even more. So
Well, they do the
you
same
think I'm going to
thing,
do
and
that
they
and
do
then
the
give it
same thing
away?
with universities.
No.
They
I
won't.
mean,
A lot of these professors, they'll spend years writing a textbook, and there's arguments on both sides. Regarding is it because a lot of these textbooks, my daughter's at University of Georgia, so some of these textbooks are hundreds of dollars. I go, oh my gosh, a book for hundreds of dollars. But I can understand why someone who spends their life learning and obtaining this knowledge just don't want to just give it away because that's part of their livelihood is being able to sell these books.
I'll
Now,
put it to you this
you
way: if
know,
if I can't sell it, I won't give it to anybody. As far as I'm concerned, they can go buy all their own equipment and they can take engines apart and they can blow things up and they can figure out what's tight and what's loose on their own, just like I did. You know, there was no way, and trust me, I'm not the only guy that's done that. A lot of us have done that, but it's the only way you're going to do that is by blowing things up and figuring out what works, figuring out what makes too much noise, figuring out what makes you lose oil pressure. There's a sweet spot. You know,
yeah.
most of these engines go together too tight. And, at the end of the day, too tight is too hot, shears the oil, causes friction problems, causes a lot of problems, especially on the track. You go the other way and it's too loose, it makes noise. Okay. An engine that's too loose, it's not going to fail. It just makes noise. So I'm in the process of building a race engine right now. It's got clearances and tolerances in it that are double what I would use on the street. The difference is that engine can't idle at less than 2,000 RPM. When it comes into the pit, it's idling at $2,000. It can't idle at 1,000. If it does, it has no oil pressure. Okay, so that's the difference between something that is designed to turn 8,000 RPM all day long, or something that's made to do 0 to 60 on the street all day long. It's two different applications. Race engines, loose is fast, as we say. So, you got to be loose with a race engine, or it's going to end up with all kinds of problems. But at the end of the day, if you're too loose, then you end up with other problems. You know, spot, and you got to find that. There's no book that tells you that. That's why I've been putting together the specifications manual, and doing all the things that I've been doing. And honestly, right now, when I finish this race engine, I've got to finish doing all the specs for what I call the boring engines. I've already got all the stuff for the 3.6s and the 3.8s and the X51s. My clearances now and the things that I'm doing are on the small stuff, the 2.5 and the 2.7, which are rather boring when you're working on a 500 horsepower M96, and you go back to the very beginning and you go back to a 2.5 and you start flowing the cylinder heads, and you're working with parts that are so small, it feels like you're working with a toy because of how much more size everything is with the bigger stuff. But those clearances and tolerances with the small engines matter even more, especially considering most of the guys that actually competitively race these things are stuck with a 2.5 engine because of spec Boxster and some of these other classes. So they're stuck with that. So some of the people that actually need the specs and the clearances and all that next level stuff more than anybody else are the guys putting these limited prep little tiny 2.5 engines together.
Well, I know that we could we could talk about this all night, and I've got there's several other topics that's been hitting around on Renless, and I do know that people do appreciate your knowledge when you offer it free, like Aaron and the Do It Yourself guy channel. I can't remember what. I think it's Do It Yourself. I can't remember his YouTube channel, but he's very appreciative of you helping him on the head, the lifter damage.
Yeah, so let's bring that up because we got to get on this service interval thing because that's a hot topic, especially with spring coming up. And I know that
Okay.
on the flat six side, we've got a lot of tickets lately about that. The LN side, there's been tickets. Spring is IMS bearing season, so definitely that's people right now. They've only got a few weeks before it's going to start warming up in most parts of the country. That's one reason why we wanted to talk about that. But,
yes.
What gets
Definitely.
me, and this is kind of a kick, is when people buy our video, and I say it's ours, it's my knowledge and it's your videography and it's your editing and it's your compilation and all that. But when they buy our video, and you can tell that they are using our video in their video because they use the same chem wipe towels, they've got the same Sharpie marks, they've got some of the same tools, they've got some of the same things done. You can see the marks on the bolts, things like that. When I scroll through YouTube or somebody sends me a link, usually I don't scroll through YouTube. I'm too busy doing than watching other people. But at the end of the day, somebody will send me a link and say, "Look at this," and I go check it out, and I'm like, "Yeah." But the guy's not giving the credit to the video. He wants it to look like he is the guy that came up with the ways to do this, and he is going to show other people how to do it. So I call these people parrots, right? They watch our video. They don't cover their tracks quite well enough. They leave a lot of clues to show that they had our video, and then they show how they put this engine together. And they don't bother telling the full story about, hey, I had this video and I watched it, and now I'm showing you how I did it. If they would just do that, it'd be a lot more cool. Otherwise, it's kind of plagiarism as far as I'm concerned. What do you think about that?
Well, absolutely. We for those who don't know, I was the producer director for the M9X series that's on Amazon Prime, and you can get the DVDs from Ellen Engineering and Pelican Parts. We have a large group that BMI, who's responsible for protecting all the copyright associated with the recording industry, also watches any unauthorized duplication of the M9X video series. So copyright sometimes is a very hard thing sometimes to prove because you can get into intellectual property rights. Like say, I was just mentioning University of Georgia. Professors who do research and go out and speak, the content and the research data that they have been working on for sometimes years is protected. Basically, they have intellectual property rights. A lot of people think that they can take that data and go and republish it or whatever they want to do with it. Today's world with everybody sharing everything these days, you think anything goes. Well, that's not the case. So I would say to the person that wants to copy it or wants to parrot it, parroting means basically you watch it and you start a monetized YouTube channel and you go through all the stages to the T. I would say don't do that because I'm asking you as a producer that has a family, and yes, these videos are sold for a reason. And my cameras that behind me, they're not cheap. And the media that I use in these cameras are not cheap. It takes money to do this. So I'm asking those who are using these videos to learn how to build engines, but want to start their own YouTube channel parroting everything that Jake Raby did. You're wrong. And there's a group called BMI that watching. So
well, and the thing,
it's
but
not going to be
by the
me
same
always.
token,
It's going to be you. They're going to be them contacting you, and you don't want them contacting you.
so to me, it's a different world if they watch the video and then they see how we do it, they see the basic concept, and then if they come up with their own way of doing it, a different way of doing it, that's fine. I love that, right? Because there's more than one way to skin a cat, as we say. But and there's been several of these folks that have done this, and if you're doing that, just say, hey, I got this video, and this video has guided me through this. Right. And if you find something you don't like in the video, say that. Say, well, I did this and this didn't work or whatever. I challenge you to do that because it's not going to happen, because I do that video step by step as I'm building the engine the way that several thousand of these engines have been built. But if you follow that video, you will know exactly how to get from stage 1 through stage 20 and build that engine in 15 hours of edited content. And
Oh yeah, I mean it could be no different than someone getting a copy of a screenplay. Let's just say you're a writer and you wrote a screenplay and you're trying to get it funded. Someone gets a copy of it and then they go and hire actors and produce the movie. They think it's perfectly fine because they're directing it and they're using the actors, but they don't realize that that screenplay is protected. So we can go on and on and on about the different forms and how. See, again, we're living in this world where everything is so easily copied. Music is one of the biggest things that people copy online. With this whole history with Napster and all that. That a lot of people got busted at UGA when that was happening. By the way, but anyway, I just say just send us a note. Say, hey, look, I learned from your videos, but I want to just document it on YouTube. Just let us know. And usually,
and now I will say,
if
a couple of guys
contacts us, if BMI contacts me, said, hey, we've already got a guy that's using your video to do a series, then I can go ahead and say it's all cool. I'll let that kind of thing. But just going in and parroting everything that Jake Raby has done, I think is crossing the line. So normally, like I say, if someone's doing their own thing and making their own work and building these engines their own way, that's one thing. But it's not very hard to identify someone that's going step by step and knowing all the little tricks that only Jake Raby.
Oh, I can look at it. I can.
There are a lot of them.
It's so burned in my mind. I can tell by the tools they've laid out. I can tell by, like I said, Sharpie marks on things, because we give a lot of tricks. There's a lot of tricks in there about how to mark stuff. There's all kinds of stuff that when you've edited all that content and you've been a part of it, it's burned in your brain housing group, and you know exactly, what that content is. So when you start seeing, I mean, who knows about the Chem Wipes towels? I mean, seriously, they are made for science. They're made for labs. Do you think somebody's going to use those towels in their garage unless they
Yeah.
saw me using them on
I
my
actually,
engine? No.
I've been using Kim Whites for years. Not me personally, but the engineers, the service engineers that come in and service all the studio equipment to wipe down the internal components back before we went to solid state memory. We had digital tape and analog tape, and they would use Kim wipes to clean the heads on the tape players and stuff. And so that's the first time. So when I met you and I saw those things, it's like took me back because they don't really use them much anymore, but just because we've moved to solid state memory and stuff like that. But occasionally you'll see the engineers still use other equipment. But yeah, it just doesn't. The thing is that and my dad was also an electronics engineer who worked for Panasonic. And that's kind of how I got into doing what I do. And they're big on Kim wipes too. So when they're cleaning down the components and stuff, it doesn't leave any residue or anything like that. Little fibers.
Yeah,
Leaves
but
it's
I
really
can't
clean.
tell you the last time that I went to a shop and saw them, or certainly in somebody's garage. So if you got those sitting there and you're working on one of these engines, you probably got the video. So, but it's just kind of funny sometimes too,
Yeah.
about that. But if somebody just says, "Hey, I follow this video," or they can say, "Hey, I hate this video," at least they're giving the video credit.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And if they're just
I mean, that's
documenting, we've had several that have contacted us and they enjoy what they've learned, but they want to kind of document their experience of building the engine. That's cool. But when you actually start breaking it down, and it's to the T of how Jake does it and the things that he said and the little things that are not going to be in the shop manual, it's like,
well,
yeah.
and I mean, the way I look at it is these last couple of times when we mentioned this, and you were like, "Well, BMI or whatever." I'm like, "I don't worry about it. I'm not doing that anymore." Somebody plays it again, we're going to stick them on it like a canine, as far as I'm concerned. So,
Well,
okay, so let's get on these service intervals, because that's
absolutely, absolutely. That's what we need to be talking about, because I mean, I would hope people get the video series and learn from it. And I tell people, look, if you really want to learn these engines, even if you're not going to, build one of these engines, you really want to learn the video from Jake. I mean, really dissects this thing down to every little bit, and it's just a great learning resource.
The thing is, it's component geography. It shows you where the intermediate shaft is, where the timing chains are. I explain how the stuff works as I'm putting it together. So it shows you where everything is. It shows you how it goes together. It shows you how it functions. It shows you what tools you need if you're going to do that. So if you just want to learn about the engine and you never plan on building one, you can do that. I can't tell you how many customers have bought an engine from us, and they also bought the video. They already bought an engine. They're never going to build one themselves, but they want to see what it's like to follow through with me doing that work. And they want to see kind of what it took to build their engine. And, like I said, they're never going to end up building one. There's no reason for them to. But they are just inquisitive, and they want to understand the nomenclature and the geography inside the engine.
Absolutely. And just so you know, everybody out there, this is taking the engine to the long block state. We do not cover removing the engine out of the car and putting all the ancillaries on it, but the beast of engine building is covered, which is getting it built from a million pieces into the long block. And so, anyway, that being said, the other hot topic of the decade, or at least 2 decades, has been IMS bearings, and it's like politics and religion. Boy, when I can remember when I first was looking at Porsches, I was immediately found out about this, probably even before I bought one, because I wanted to know what these cars, the problems the cars had, and immediately go, what in the world is this intermediate shaft bearing?
Well, I was going to say,
boy,
Bobby,
it was some hot topics over if it was just all made up, and the class action lawsuit and all this and that. And now here we are. I would think the topic has calmed down. I think people are realizing that this is a component that will need to be changed out, but there's still a lot of misinformation out there. I think people, I see it all
Well,
the time. I see it, how
let's
many
take
times.
this back. Let's take it back and just let's start with the history behind the entire thing. I think that's the easiest way to do it. And I want to start this off by saying that in today's modern world, servicing a vehicle is a lot different in the eyes of the beholder than it used to be. So back in the day, cars, they had more service intervals from the factory. You know, your service directive guide would tell you more things. Now that's the days of carburetors and points, where you had to even gap your spark plug. Now the spark plug comes out of a box with a certain number on it. It's got a certain gap in it because people can't even gap their own spark plugs. But at the end of the day, you know, I come from an arena in the aviation world, the rotary wing aviation world, where service and maintenance are done to keep things flying. So, you know, I tend to always have a service interval for everything, whether the factory gave it to me or not. Um, so that's going to be part of the history behind of all of this, because, you know, with service intervals on bearings, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. And the one thing I want to say is we were the originators of all of this. I made the tools. I made the process to extract the bearing. I came up with those things before anybody else did. So the history behind this goes all the way back to the very beginning, because in the very beginning, the squabbles on these forums wasn't about changing the bearing and which one to use or how to do it. It was all the way to the fact of that can't be done. The factory says you can't do that. The factory didn't put a part number on that bearing. The factory didn't give us a tool to change that bearing. The factory didn't give us a procedure to change that bearing. These are facts, people. This is the honest God fact. So if you go back 15 or so years on some of these forums and you just search IMS bearing, you will see that the topics were not what they are today. The topic was you can't do it, it can't be done, there's no reason to do it, but I heard they're failing. Or one guy lost a couple of engines in the same car because it failed. So that is the history of this, is that the fights used to be that it can't be done, you can't do that. So then, and I'm just going to hit the bull by the horns here and say that now a lot of people think that the service intervals that have been stated for these bearings being the IMS retrofit bearings, which is everything other than an IMS solution. Okay. There's only one IMS solution. It's got my name on the patent. 8992089 is the patent number on it. And that is the only IMS solution. That is the product name. So there's only one IMS solution, and it is a plain bearing that is oil pressure fed. Now there's other confusingly similar oil pressure fed bearings out there, but they're not a plain bearing. Okay, they have this, they're either a regular ball bearing or somebody's changed it over and they're trying to use it with one of the roller bearings, and they're trying to just spray oil against a dynamic surface that's turning, and they're trying to add lubrication to it, and they think that's the key. Lubrication was never the problem. Okay, there's a lot of things there that are part of the issue, but lubrication really isn't the issue. If you get down to it, the real issue is that the factory bearing was sealed and the lubrication that was permanently put into it at the factory was inadequate. Okay. So from that perspective, you do have lubrication as an underlying cause. But if that bearing had not have had a seal on it, we wouldn't be here today. If the factory bearings would have been open from the factory, more than likely there would have never been enough of these engines that had a failure to ever warrant me doing the things that I did back in those days. Okay. So things have gone now to a point where people think that the service intervals are new for these bearings. Okay. And they're not. These service intervals were put in when numero uno LN Engineering IMS retrofit bearing was released. Very first one. The problem is people don't read. People would look at, they would open up the website, they would see one thing, they see the cost, they see the procedure I used to have broken down, and they go to a local shop. The local shop doesn't read. Okay. So they never bothered telling people that a bearing has a 5-year 50,000 or a 6-year 75,000 or whatever the case may be. They just put it in, and then later on, the person finally reads something, or they read something on a forum, or something pops up in their email, or whatever the case may be, and they think that, oh, this has a service interval now. These people want to sell more bearings. That's the first thing they think. And that's bullshit. That's not the case, because it's not LN's fault that the person didn't read it's not even fine print. They didn't read any of the directives about it. So, if you look at it the way that it's laid out there, people also think that this whole lineage of the way the bearings were produced and the way they were released was part of some strategic initiative to milk money from people's pockets. That's also not the case, because the very first thing that I invented was the IMS solution. Night number one that I took one of these engines apart, not knowing anything about it, I invented the IMS solution that night. We had a prototype within 3 weeks. I knew very little about these engines when I came up with it, but I knew that the ball bearing that somebody put in this engine from the factory is the last thing that it needed. So I wanted to make it like a Metzger engine. I wanted to make it more like even a 547 4-cam engine, which
Wasn't
actually
it
shares the same
Bruce
characteristics.
Anderson? Wasn't it Bruce Anderson that approached you and Charles about this problem? Or am I mistaken?
Yeah, so that goes way back. Bruce, of course, he wrote the 911 Performance Guide, and he wrote for Panorama, he wrote for Excellence, he wrote for everybody back in the day. He was an air-cooled engine guru, and he never really learned that much about these engines. He was already retired by the time these cars came out, pretty much. But at the end of the day, he was getting the letters. They were coming in, letters to the technical editor, blah, blah, blah. My engine blew up. It's got some bearing problem. I don't know what this is. Bruce knew everybody. He got the lowdown that engines were failing because of this bearing. He got a hold of Charles at the literature meet, the Porsche literature meet in LA one year. And he told Charles, hey, I'm going to pull you aside. You and Jake need to attack this bearing problem, because I'm getting all these notices about it. I can't write anything about it because I don't know anything about it, but definitely there's a problem here, and this is happening, and it's happening under warranty. So Charles comes home and he calls me and he's like, all right, well, we need to buy a Boxster. I'm like, why the hell do I want to buy a Boxster? Now, keep in mind, at this time, a water-cooled Porsche had never been on my property. Not a 944, not any of that stuff. None of it. I skipped right over all of that. I went from air-cooled straight to a Boxster. So I'm like, why do I want to buy a Boxster or a 996? I care nothing about those cars. And at the time, one of my usernames on the Pelican forums was no H2O. It's still on there. So he said, well, there's a bearing blowing up, and Bruce Anderson told me about it, and that got my attention. And I'm like, okay, hold on. And he starts saying these engines, these engines have a problem. And when I heard, okay, they have a problem and these things are being denied, then I'm like, okay, now I like these cars. Now I like these engines, because I like things that are a black sheep. I like things that are a problem.
Jake, was
just
this during warranty period when you knew about this? When you started hearing about this?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
that's why
I would think
Bruce couldn't
that
write it.
a lot of that's what I think. I think Bruce, probably because of his level of expertise and his reputation in the industry, I think he probably was very careful not to say something about knowing the whole truth on the problem, since he just really didn't know a lot about these cars at the time. Maybe there was some pressure from Porsche to say, hey, and tell me if I'm wrong. I mean, I talked to some of these Porsche techs back in the day, and they would say, a lot of the engines were just being replaced, but there was really not. It was kind of like hush, hush, hush. It was not like they talked about it.
Well, what we're doing here was never designed to happen. The reason why there's no specifications, the factory never wanted these engines to be rebuilt. The plan was they had so many engines, the engines are so economical that if you have a problem, you buy another one and then you put it in the car. So when we first started putting these things together, we couldn't buy any parts. We couldn't buy head bolts. We couldn't buy rod bearings. We couldn't buy any of that stuff. The first few engines I built got Chevrolet rod bearings because we couldn't buy anything else. So because there was nobody working on this stuff at all. It was like a black box. At that time, about the only thing you could get in the part system were like head gaskets, water pump gaskets, things like that. There was nothing else that was there. Actually, in some of those days, Wayne Dempsey, of course, started Pelican. He helped us get some of the stuff in the very beginning because no wholesalers had it. So he helped us get some parts that we couldn't find otherwise because the dealer was totally disinterested in helping anybody. And they didn't know anything because keep in mind, at this point, the factory technicians weren't really even qualified to work on these engines. They went to a week-long class about them, but they were so cheap to get replaced. It's like, okay, let's just replace it. So I had a guy come to work for me in the early days. He had actually been a service technician at Brumos, and he worked there for a couple of years. And he went to Porsche school. He had all the master tech stuff, all those diplomas and all that crap. And his first day on the job at my shop, a Boxster is there, and that it needed a lifter job. And it was misfiring, it wasn't making noise, but the lifters were hung up. And if the car sat for a few days, it wouldn't start because the lifters were sticking, holding all the valves open. So I told him, I'm like, look, man, we got to do a lifter job on this. And he goes, huh? How do I do that? And I'm like, what? Didn't you work at the dealer? He's like, dude, we never even went inside the cam covers on these engines. We didn't do any of that. So day one on the job, he already was tasked with something he had never ever been tasked with in a few years at the dealer. So that's the problem. So, at the end of the day, the stuff was so cheap and it was so easy to replace. It was just a matter of click, 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 drop the engine out, click, 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 put the engine in, and you're done. So that's really what the whole kind of concept was with this. Now, what really threw a wrench in that was two things. One was the economy. When after the big boom, when recession hit, these engines doubled in price overnight because it was a compound issue. Not only did the recession hit, but then also the dollar versus the euro tanked. So then you had engines that it made sense to have a guy like me repair it because we were doing a ton of repairs at this time because you couldn't just replace it anymore. At the time, I was the only guy that knew anything about them because nobody else was tearing into them, you see. And at that point, this was even before Spec Boxster. Nobody was even racing these things. I mean, there was some pro stuff going on, but the pro guys either weren't breaking things or they had a sponsorship and they would just replace engines too. So, it was all different. If you go back that far, like I said, the topics on the forums were different. You can't change that bearing. Why would you want to do that? The first time I posted the procedure for changing the bearing, there was people on these forums saying that can't be done. And I'm like, hey, jackass, here's a video of me doing it. You're saying I can't do it? Here it is. But the reason why is because everybody was brainwashed. They were all basically told something because the factory didn't give it a part number. The factory didn't give it a procedure. So therefore it can't be done.
Yeah. It it's an interesting history, and here we are, and of course, you brought more public awareness to the issue starting back, I guess, 2015, not 2015, probably 2017 or so, when when the Porsche Club of America approached you about doing a whole series on the
Yeah,
IMS
and now that was
bearing.
interesting. Let me tell you what was interesting about that. I never would have dreamed they would do that, right? Because it was a hot topic and it pisses people off. I mean, there's people that started, huge websites about I got ripped off by Porsche on this bearing or whatever, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, the factory didn't do anything wrong. They did what all modern manufacturers were doing at the time. You know, finite element analysis. They went with bearing specifications from the bearing manufacturer. Somebody put their heads together. The design team put their heads together on paper. All of it worked out. This isn't the old days when they would put a German soldier in a car and go say, drive this thing 50,000 kilometers and bring it back. This is modern day times. So the factory didn't do anything wrong. They did the same thing then that they do now. They did the same thing that Mercedes does and GM does and everybody does. That's why there's so many recalls on cars these days, because at the end of the day, the consumer is your development department. That's just the way it is. I've got a 2017 F-250. It's the only modern car that I own. It's the only car I own that has OBD2, right? Everything else I've got is a 1992 or older. And I don't drive the truck a lot unless I'm going to my remote property or I'm towing something. I don't drive it. It's only got 50-some thousand miles on it. It's 2017. But that thing has 19 recalls on it. Now, it's never broken on me. It's never given me a problem. But it has 19 freaking recalls. And they can't even get the parts to fix it because it's got so many recalls that they can't get all the parts to fix the thing. So, I mean, to me, that's the way everything has gone. It goes concept to showroom in the shortest amount of time possible, and we hope there's not a problem. That's just the way that it is. That's why things don't live as long as they used to. But, you know, at the end of the day, again, the factory didn't know that. Do you think they would have put this thing together knowing it's going to break? No, there's no way in the world they would have done that.
And they never considered a service issue. They never considered
well,
being a service
and see,
part.
the thing is, so we're talking about service intervals tonight, but people don't listen to my service interval, which comes from my direct experience, because the factory didn't give a service interval for the bearing. Matter of fact, they didn't give it a part number. They didn't give it a procedure for replacement. They didn't give it one single freaking page in the manual about building this engine. So when we go about talk to people, say, hey, you need to change this bearing every 5 years or 50,000 miles or 6 years, 75,000 miles or whatever the case may be based on the bearing you've got, they don't want to listen to that. They just want to say, I didn't know that. And why are you bringing it up now? Well, you didn't know it because you were ignorant because you didn't read it. And you didn't know it because the shop that did the work wasn't a certified installer. Therefore, they were not basically held in a vice to tell you these things. Certified installers have to tell you these things. And we'll talk more later about why it's important to have a certified installer do the job, and why you don't just price shop this job. But at the end of the day, the service intervals have been the same since the very beginning. They haven't changed. Nobody's trying to sell you another bearing. Matter of fact, LN's even done some, a lot of, I guess we could call it specials, or really it's something where if you've got a retrofit bearing already in the car, you turn that bearing back in and you have money toward an IMS solution that never needs to be changed, right? All right, so do you have any questions for me, Bobby, about this? Because I knew there were some people who wanted you to ask me questions.
About
right?
service intervals?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I did a graphic, and I guess some of the questions that I've seen over the years are, if it hasn't failed, it's never really going to fail. A lot of these guys that have them for an extended period of time, and they think it's never going to fail.
So
And
with
then
that,
some of
though,
them,
you're talking.
don't consider, they don't consider the time being an issue. Or I mean, excuse me, the miles. Like I've only driven it. I've had a car now for 5 years. I've only driven it 10,000 miles. Should I change the bearing? I mean, it's only, what I'm saying, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, so there's two different sides to that coin. One, you're talking about a factory original IMS bearing that came in that engine from the factory. Or two, you're talking about a retrofit bearing that replaced the former factory bearing before it failed. So there's two different sides to that coin. So let's talk about the guy that still has an original IMS bearing in his engine and it hasn't failed yet. The only thing he needs to do is talk to somebody who has had a failure. That's all he needs to do. And you understand that you don't want to have that happen to you. So, it takes it from a very scheduled, very cheap, very easy to do process of retrofitting the bearing with a known high quality replacement. It takes it from something where you can have your car dropped off and have it back in a couple of days. It costs you a few $1,000s, and you get good return on your investment later on down the road because you make sure the engine's not going to fail. And that way, you're also increasing the desirability of your car in the marketplace. Because now, in today's world, if a car has not had an IMS bearing retrofit and you've not documented that, you're going to have a hard time selling said car. That's just the way it is. People don't want to buy a problem. So if you do go ahead and replace that IMS bearing, and you do it with a certified installer, and it's done correctly, and the old bearing sent in, the warranty is activated, it's put into the IMS bearing registry, so it can be looked up, it can be quantified. If you do those things, you are adding another layer to your investment in the car. It's a double positive. One, it's not going to fail. And two, you're adding desirability and marketability to said car if you ever do need to sell it. Now, some people look at it like, I love this car, I'm keeping it forever. They don't worry about a sales value. But you always need to think about that because something might happen where you've got to sell that car. And at the end of the day, it could be a physical issue, somebody, some death in the family, whatever the case may be, hard times, and you need to sell that car. You're going to get a great return on your investment because you did a proactive IMS retrofit procedure. And hopefully you use the IMS solution to do that, which is a be all end all. There's no service interval for it. You're servicing the bearing every time you change the oil because the oil is what is supporting the IMS bearing because it uses that pressurized film of oil.
I'm going ahead and put up the service interval so that people can see.
Okay. So that side of the coin is basically the side of the coin where somebody has not retrofitted their engine. Now, let's talk about what happens if they just decide to roll the dice. Okay. And today we get a lot of people that send tickets into the flat six side that have rolled the dice. And we at the peak of this, we were getting 7 to 8 IMS bearing failures a week at some points. This is before the class action lawsuit. Now, keep in mind, at the time, I was the only guy doing any of that stuff. So if one of these things failed, we knew about it, period. I don't care where it was in the world. If an engine failed with an IMS bearing, they Googled it. It came up with us, came up with LN. I got the phone call. Usually I got the job to build the engine or got the job to repair it because a lot of these engines were so low mileage, it made sense to repair it and not even build the whole thing. Okay. But this is a whole different world back then than it is now. Not to age myself or, but I'm just saying it was a lot different back then than it is now. So if somebody has not done that yet and they're rolling the dice, like I said, all they've got to do is talk to somebody who rolled the dice and they got snake eyes. Or they talk to somebody who didn't even know they were rolling dice because the majority of the people that have had IMS bearing failures don't even know what the bearing is. They don't even have an idea that it's in the engine. They don't know anything about it. If they're lucky, they buy a car and they Google floor mats for Porsche Boxster or floor mats for Porsche 996. And then as soon as 996 for Boxster goes in there, it brings up a bunch of stuff and it starts talking about an IMS bearing failure. And they start reading that and then their head explodes and they're like, I had no idea what the hell this was. I bought a ticking time bomb. Well, not in all cases. Okay. But so many of them didn't know that they had a bearing in the engine that could fail until it did. Now, that's where the class action lawsuit did two things. One, it really helped with people being brought up to speed that there was a problem. So it certainly did educate people that there's a problem. Two, it validated that, yes, this is a big enough problem for there to be a class action lawsuit. And that year, the amount of engines that had IMS bearing retrofits was an all-time record. It's never been that way before because it was actually valid. People wouldn't listen to me. They wouldn't listen to Charles at LN because they thought we had something to sell to them. And that was it. But as soon as that class action lawsuit came out and the validity hit, And the reality hit. The people that had been rolling the dice, or the people that didn't know anything about this problem, they immediately didn't want to have the problem. Well, now, fast forward all these years, and every single one of those cars that had this done from 2011, 2013, in that time period, every one of them has a bearing in it that's out of date, because it has a service interval that is not just mileage, but is also impacted by time. Just like everything that you learn in aviation, everything has a time, everything has an hour. Okay. It's hours versus miles. But there's also a service directive for most of the important things that say you will replace this by X amount of time. Okay. So,
So the guy
so we
that
came up
stores their
with that.
car,
I was going to say, we came up with that not just out of the blue. We came up with it based on calculations of how many bearings we were pulling out of engines that were in a failing state at certain mileage points and certain times of service life, okay? Time and service, and also from the people who have manufactured the parts for the bearings that we were using to fit into the engines, okay? So this was not just something we were doing between Charles and I. There were other people in this world that were ball bearing experts and ball bearing manufacturers. Putting a ball bearing together is like a freaking black art. So we were using the other service intervals from these bearings and other applications that were in similar states of load and similar speeds to determine, hey, this particular bearing in this other application is pretty confusingly similar to what we've got going on here. It's basically still an outer race rotation. It's got a similar kind of load on it, and they're saying it's good for 3 years or 5 years or whatever the case may be. So this is where these things came up. So in the very beginning, we were worried about service intervals when the first bearings were sold. So, go ahead.
well, I was just going to ask these guys that don't drive their cars, for whatever reason, they store them for, we did a whole series with Pete's 996, and it didn't have, 20-year-old car, it didn't have any miles on it, but it had IMS bearing failure. So what exactly is going on when a car sits? Let's just say it's been sitting for years with that bearing. What's going on? What is it
Well,
about the time? If it's never been driven, it's got oil sitting in the sump. What's going on that would hurt that bearing?
the same thing that's going on that hurts the whole rest of the engine, okay, and the whole rest of the car. So I have a lot of cars. I have a lot of old cars. I have a lot of cars that are pre-World War II. I have my oldest car's in 1930. And I have a lot of newer cars and a lot of stuff from the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. And I drive all my stuff. But a couple of my vehicles are absolute museum quality, and they're in museums right now, and I still drive them. Matter of fact, I went to the museum 2 weeks ago, and I went and drove one of my cars and had to dig it out of the car, out of the stable, so to speak, to be able to do it. But what people don't understand about any car setting static, they would understand if they had to work on said car, and a lot of cars like that, and they saw that it was constant problems. Okay. The brake fluid goes bad. Brake fluid soaks up humidity, and that turns into water in the brake fluid. Then all your brake components corrode. Okay. Everything in the car suffers because it's not getting lubricated. It's not getting ran. It's not getting circulated. Okay. Inside of engines can rust. Inside of gearboxes can rust. I've even had equipment do this. So I had an old Van Norman milling machine. I got it from Georgia Tech. It was a 1970 model, but it had only been used something like 10 hours from 1970 to 1998. I buy it in 1998. I hook it up in my shop. I change the oil in it. The oil comes out perfectly clear, perfectly clean, like it was new. I run the machine for 2 hours and it locks up the spindle. And I'm like, what happened? I take it apart, everything in it's rusted because all the oil ran off of everything. That oil was clean because it hadn't been ran. If I would have ran it and then changed the oil, it would have been solid rust. So I've seen the insides of transmissions rust like this. So everything that is a mechanical creation needs to be exercised. It needs to be ran, it needs to be driven, because oil soaks up a lot of crap from the environment. Oil oxidizes. It ends up building acids because you got different materials in the engine, and those things are, the engine's not sealed up either. Air can get into it. So we see that oil oxidizes. We see that components can rust. A good example, I'm building an engine right now for Miles Collier at Revs Institute. Okay, he's got over 100 very well-known cars at his museum in Naples, Florida. I've built several engines for Mr. Collier, and I love it because he wants things perfect, and he wants them the way they were back in the day. Matter of fact, I'm not even able to change bearings in one of the engines that I'm working on because he wants to keep the original stuff. I'm recoding them and doing things to them, but I'm truly restoring that engine. And at Revs, these cars get exercised. Every car has its own directives about when it comes out of storage. Okay, when it comes out of whatever gallery, they take it out to the Naples airport next door. They run it around on the outside of the airport. They bring it back in. They change all the fluids, even if the car hasn't been driven. Okay, there is a protocol for every single car in that museum, which is not really a museum. It's a automotive research center. And those cars are also actively raced. 908s, 910s, 917s. They race these cars, and that's the way they give them exercise. So there's something that people don't understand, and that is that these components are in service even if the car's not running. They're still exposed to the environment. They're still exposed to adverse conditions. And to me, storage is an adverse condition. I would much rather a car be driven as it be stored. To me, storing
And the
anything
IMS bearing
mechanical
is
is horrible.
also, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but the IMS bearing is under tension. I mean, it's being pulled in a certain direction. Over time, that pressure on the bearing will have an effect, will it not?
Yeah. So every time the engine shuts off, it's going to shut off in a slightly different crankshaft position. Okay. Usually these engines will shut off at mid-bore. That's when all three pistons on each bank of the engine are pretty much in the center, because at that point, no particular cylinder is at bottom dead center, no particular cylinder is at top dead center. Engines have the tendency to shut off in that position. Old four-cylinder air-cooled engines shut off at 90 degrees, not TDC, as long as they're well-tuned. Same thing with these. So every time you shut it off, it's going to be in a slightly different position. But in my experience, the position that it shuts off in is a position where you've always got two camshaft lobes, at least two camshaft lobes, fully on lobe. One intake and one exhaust is going to be fully open. That's putting, and usually it's one on each side of the engine, obviously, because the way the firing order is 162435 is the firing order. So it fires across the engine. So you're usually going to have one set of intake valves open, one set of exhaust valves open, a couple others that are just starting to open, a couple others that are just starting to close, and then a couple that are off lobe. That's just the way a six-cylinder engine is going to be. So when it shuts off, you have a scenario where you've got a couple of chain tensioners. The chain tensioner for bank one is on the intermediate shaft side of the engine, the IMS bearing side of the engine. So it's on the driven side of that shaft. So that tensioner is drawing the IMS assembly toward bank one, because it's got a chain tensioner. It's putting pressure on that chain. Plus it's got chain load from trying to open a couple of valves. Then you've got the IMS chain, which is driven from the intermediate shaft down or up to the crankshaft. You've got that forcing tension directly on the intermediate shaft as well. So both of those are putting some stress on the bearing and the timing chains as well. I've seen engines stretch timing chains that never ran. Okay. I've had a 996 turbo have a timing chain failure. It had like 11,000 miles on it. A friend of mine had one happen at 7,000 miles. And that's a 996 turbo thing, is to have chain stretch. And usually it's bank two. And if you build one of those engines, you'll learn why it's bank two. But at the end of the day, the bearing's still in service. It's still seeing load, and it's got acids. It's got oxidized oil. It's got all these other things that are playing into it, and especially if you're not changing the oil in the car frequently enough, because that oil is already old and tired. And people are under the misconception also that they don't have to change the oil if the car's not getting driven. You don't find that at Revs Institute, and you don't find that in the aviation world, and you don't find that with cars that I own, and you don't find that with people who understand how things work. Because I keep things changed no matter what. I've got some cars in the last 3 years, I've only put maybe 200 miles on them, and I still keep the oil changed. Now, I might take the old oil out of it and save it for my tractors or save it for my equipment, because it's okay for a tractor or a piece of equipment, but I don't want to leave it in the engine of my 500E or something that I really care about.
Yeah, that's super cool. I mean, I think, a lot of people think that, well, I haven't driven the car. I mean, I put the bearing in it 3 years ago and I haven't driven it. I changed the oil. It should be fine. But it's interesting, some of these shops, not even just your shop and Ellen Engineering, have dissected these engines and taken the bearings apart. I remember several shops that actually did that, and they saw that what the eating into the pitting, if you will, into the bearing, and where on one side of I guess it's a race, on the actual bearing itself. So it's interesting. It would have the cars that weren't driven. It would have that telltale sign of where it's worn on one side of on the race, and maybe it's not the race. Maybe it's I'm getting my
No, the inner race usually sees that, and it's usually in
maybe
a certain position, and it's because the tensioners are putting tension on that, and
yeah.
of course, it's squeezing oil out of those areas. And at the end of the day, keep in mind the factory bearings are sealed. So a sealed bearing is something like a wheel bearing, or a bearing in a lawnmower deck, or a bearing in a piece of equipment. There was no reason for the factory to use a sealed bearing for this, other than the fact that probably it looked like a good application. If anything ever got into the oil, it would basically keep that oil from getting into the bearing and causing a problem. But the problem is that the permanent lubrication that was in said bearing doesn't hold up to the temperatures that the bearing sees inside this engine, with 250-degree or
That's what I
so
was thinking.
oil around it.
And then eventually it shrinks, and then it's compromised.
Yeah.
And I know when
So
you
we'll
pull
talk
my
about
bearing out of my car, I know that the shaft was filled with sludge. I mean, just real thick, just nasty stuff, and it just poured out of there. And I know a lot of folks see that kind of thing, but it's amazing to see what, like you said, a car that hasn't been driven, but it's been sitting up for a long time, what it does to the bearing. Is it correct to say that the bearing is actually submerged in oil if the sump is filled correctly, the partial submersion of the bearing too?
Yeah, it's
And
partially
so,
immersed in oil. Absolutely, it is, which is one reason why the solution works so well, is because it's always gonna, when you start the engine up, it's always got some oil already on the parts. So that's one thing we learned through the development of the IMS solution with a plain bearing, that startup oil delivery was not a problem, because it always had oil there. As long as somebody wasn't running the oil level too low, you always had oil there. So now, Bobby, I think what we really need to do is focus on, all right, the guy that has a bearing that's been retrofitted, and he doesn't know when it was done, or maybe he does know when it was done. What does he need to do? Because he's the guy that currently is confused about this. He's the guy that I wanted to do this video for, because we get so many messages. Even people that we did not do IMS retrofits for. When I stopped doing retrofits in like 2019, because we were too busy with engines, I didn't want to have a shop anymore. Now I don't even have a shop anymore. Atlanta Speedworks leased out my facility, so we just retained our engine building and development facility. We don't even have a place to work on a car. We don't even have a hoist anymore. So at the end of the day, when I started doing that or stopped doing that work, we had done about 740 IMS bearing retrofits. And that would be from day one, the very first one, all the way through the IMS solution. Now, when I came out with a solution, I was installing those before anybody knew it existed. If I had a cool guy come in, matter of fact, I had one from South Carolina. He was a really cool guy. He came in, he was a retired general, and he was a Marine, and I was on the same page with him. And I said, okay, here is my retrofit bearing. Here's my ball bearing that we've come up with for this. He looked at it. I said, now I want you to close your eyes. I'm going to put something in your hand. Okay, so he closed his eyes, and I put the IMS solution in his hand. I said, now open your eyes. He looks at it for a second, and he says something like, oh my goodness. He was smart enough to understand what I'd done. I said, okay, do you want this newest solution, which is actually the oldest solution, the very first thing we came up with that just took the longest to develop, or do you want me to put the other bearing in it that is the one that you came here for? Now, I hadn't even given him a price yet. And at the time, we were hand making these IMS solutions at extreme cost. And he said, I want that solution. I don't care. He's like, that's the simplest thing ever. I got to have it. Okay. I don't know if he still has the car or not, but it was kind of funny because he took the car to the dealer to have a shift cable changed, and they saw the oil hose going up underneath the car, and everybody from the whole entire dealership, went out, and I think he was traveling or something. He wasn't even at home when it happened. So the whole dealership didn't even know what the solution was. And they had looked at something that they had no idea what it was. And so I wasn't even able to do that till I filed for the patent, right? But we didn't have everything in place. At the end of the day, a situation like that guy, he's done for good. He's got one of the original bearings in his engine. It's still good forever. And at the end of the day, it removes all the components. So, if you're looking at a ball bearing, in the case of the single row ball bearing, you've got 2 races, you've got a cage, and you've got 8 balls. With the IMS solution, all that's gone. You don't have any of that. You've got 1 flange that has oil going through it, and you have 1 journal that's basically your wear surface. And what goes between those 2 is a pressurized film of oil. And that oil is what's supporting things. So that's why you never need to change it. Every time you change the oil, you're changing your bearing, because the oil is the bearing. And if you ever had something happen where that was trying to wear, or it was trying to go bad, it would just open the clearance up. In that case, maybe you might hear a little bit of a rattle from the IMS or something like that, and then you take it apart and change a bushing, because the bushings are the only wear part that there is. But as long as you keep oil fed to it, you're not going to have that problem. Now, we've never need to change one of those at all, ever. So, and I don't think we ever will need to change one. I've never had anybody call and say, hey, this thing's making a noise. I'm just saying that is the only way it's really going to fail. Now, I want to bring up something that Oliver brought to my attention when he was here yesterday, I think it was, and we were on the flow bench. So he said that somebody brought up on RennList that another engine builder was basically telling people that he would not use an IMS solution because he thought the oil hose was a vulnerability, right? That is complete bullshit, and I'll explain to you the reason why. You can look at the videos that we've done, and you'll see that where the oil hose goes in this engine, okay, is all up under the car. We've only had to replace a couple of these hoses over time. One guy was racing his car, the Boxster, in rally racing, okay, off-road in the dirt, jumping the thing, and it didn't fail. It just got beat up. We replaced that one. And we had another car that had been through a crash and ran over like a parking hump. And that one needed to be replaced. But the thing is, the car was totaled. The guy bought the car back from the freaking insurance company because the damage that took out the hose took out the rest of the bottom side of the car. He bought it pretty much just so he could get the solution and some of the other stuff out of the engine and put it into a roller that he was going to buy. So you're not going to end up in a scenario driving a Porsche where you're going to have that stainless steel braided hose get damaged. In a scenario like that, somebody just wanted to sell you something else, and that was about the easiest thing they could say. They need to come up with something better because that one is old news. So, that is not a vulnerability. It's not a weak link. If anything takes that oil hose out of the bottom of your car, it's going to take out the rest of the bottom of your car. It's going to take out your sway bar. It's going to take out suspension uprights. It's going to take out the freaking, control arms. You're going to have a bigger problem than anything to do with the engine. And I think that's basically what Oliver explained to those people from what he was telling me. So at the end of the day, that's not a problem. The IMS solution gets rid of a problem, and it does it in the simplest way possible, and it does it from now on.
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. And I mean, honestly, if you don't want a service interval, that's the one to go with.
Well, you're servicing that IMS solution every time you change the oil in the car, and we give you modified service intervals and a list of approved oils and a list of approved filters to go along with it because it is a truly developed component. Okay. All right. So now let's talk about these guys again that, let's say they had a bearing that got replaced back during the class action lawsuit. What do they do now? Okay. That bearing's out of time. They think they don't need to do anything anymore because maybe they didn't read anything, and it's not even fine print. Like I said, it's out there. And they didn't read the registration documents. They didn't read any of that, or the shop didn't read it. And maybe they're listening to this tonight. So what do they need to do? They need to replace the bearing again. And if somebody told them they didn't have to, that person was not informed, or that person told them what they wanted them to hear. And I'll tell you, a lot of shops tell people what they want to hear because they want the job. And we're going to talk about this in a minute when we start talking about choosing a shop to do this work. Because not everybody has to conform to that code of conduct that LN makes the certified installers conform to. So, I think that maybe the shop doesn't tell people because they're afraid that they're not going to do the job. Okay.
I can give you an example. And this is for all those new buyers out there that are interested in getting into a Porsche 996. I was actually looking at a car here locally, and the ad said IMS bearing has been changed out, just changed out, or something like that. And fortunately, they took a picture of it said Ellen bearing too, by the way. So in the pictures, they just conveniently took a picture of the actual tag with the serial number on it.
Mm-hmm.
So what I did is I wrote down that serial number. I went to the LN site where you can go and check and see when the bearing was actually.
Yeah.
And guess what that told me? It was way out of freaking date. I mean, we're talking about 2017, I believe. So you can do the math of how many years that is. But if I just relied on just the ad, I would think, oh, there's a fresh bearing put on it. Oh, I'm good. But I did my homework and I said, well, I knew that if I bought this car, I'd immediately have to do that. Now, you may do the homework just like I did and looked on Ellen's site to see where you basically could check the date. Then you're going into it knowing that, hey, I'm going to have to put X amount of dollars aside to do this. And a lot of people will do the clutch and that kind of thing too while they're at it if it's a manual car.
Well, it makes sense to do that. But the thing is also, you mentioned that you went to the IMS registry and you were able to look it up. You can't do that if you went on one of these copycat bearings. Somebody else that has a confusingly similar product, they didn't put together an entire website with all of this information to help you. They just sold you a bearing that's probably made in Romania, or it was a $12 Chinese bearing or whatever the case may be, and they might have sold you a little kit that sprays oil onto it and made you think that there's a lubrication problem. And then they're also not going to tell you that you do need to service that bearing because now they don't care about a few years from now because they're probably going to change business names 3 times in that amount of time. So at the end of the day, they make it look like their bearing is permanent, but it's not, because all ball bearings and roller bearings have a service life, period. So they don't tell you that, and they don't give you a registry. They don't give you a procedure. They don't want to get your old bearing back so they can make sure that you actually had the job done and that you replaced a bearing that wasn't failing. So these are things that make this entire product line from the originators, not the imitators, what you want to do. Because if you buy a car that has a confusingly similar bearing in it, then you may not even know it's been replaced. Or if it is, then maybe they lied and said it had a LN bearing in it or a flat 6 bearing in it or whatever the case may be. People are lying all the time. And the reason why is because, honestly, it's tough selling one of these cars today if it hasn't had this work done. And if you are a seller of one of these cars, you have not had the bearing done, go ahead and get ready to be negotiated with. You're going to have buyers who are going to negotiate on the price of your car based on the fact that it has to have the bearing replaced. It's going to happen. So, that's another thing. It adds desirability and marketability, and it keeps the car from becoming a liability, because that $5,000 service or whatever it takes to put a IMS solution or a retrofit bearing into it, and whatever shop you go to have the work done, is either you do that, or potentially you have a $20,000+ expenditure on a reconstruction of an engine. 20 grand will buy you half of one of my engines today, because I don't cut corners. I don't haphazardly replace stuff. These engines are going for 35 to 40 grand, and they're not going to be any cheaper. And we still have demand for them at these prices because people want something that is the best they can buy. Because that's the people that have a forever car that they love. Okay. But at the end of the day, we don't see that many IMS bearing failures anymore because there's not many cars that haven't had it replaced. Now, we see every engine that comes in here gets taken apart. And what we've noticed is about half the engines that come in here today that have a failure come in for bore scoring. That's about half of them. Okay. The ones that don't come in here for bore scoring have bore scoring at some level when they come here. That's about the other 40%. But of the half that come in, they already have an LN bearing in them, or they already have a solution in them. Very seldom do we see any of the cars coming in here that have a confusingly similar bearing in it, because they're hardly selling any of them. Now, keep in mind, when they come in, they're not coming in because they've had an IMS bearing failure. They're coming in because something else brought them in, or they're coming in because somebody wanted to do an elective reconstruction, which in today's world, that's all my program supports. If it's got more than bore scoring, it's not pre-qualified for what we do. We don't want to deal with failures. We want to deal with elective jobs at this point. So it's just too dramatic dealing with failures. So, there's not very many of those other bearings that are out there because people don't trust them, and they have not earned their place in this market. They don't have a registry. They don't have service intervals. They don't have a support system. They don't have known, quantified things to support them. And they don't have somebody telling them when they need to change the oil or when they need to change the bearing. It's just like, here's a bearing, it's good forever, and they tell you what they got to sell it to you. So,
I just want to jump here. I just want to jump in here and say that, if you're looking at a car and you don't want to, you just want to figure out if they have an LN bearing or if the LN bearing is out of date. All you need is a VIN, because you don't have to. Luckily the car that I was looking at actually had the serial number, but you don't have to have a serial number. All you need is a VIN, and you go to the URL that I put in the chat, and you can put the VIN number, and it'll see if the IMS retrofit or the IMS solution has been installed on that car and when it was done.
But there is a caveat to that.
Okay.
That is only if the work was done by a certified installer who has a code of conduct that makes them do that, or if the vehicle owner takes the initiative to register said product. If they don't do that, it's not going to be in the registry because we have no idea where it came from or who did the work or what the bearing may be. So if you, there's about 20% of the bearings that have been sold that are registered, about 20%. That's it. Now, there are situations where people do not want a bearing registered. And let me explain some of this to you. And I haven't done any of this bearing sales stuff since 2009. I've been completely out of it other than technical stuff and training the certified installers. And when somebody has a problem that's next level, that's the only time I deal with it. But the scenario that usually leads to a bearing purposely not being registered is when a car has a bearing failure. Okay, so let's say an original bearing fail, keyword original, an original bearing fails. And a shop who doesn't have good morals, doesn't have good ethics, and honestly isn't very smart decides to take a Dremel tool and cut the race out of the IMS shaft where the bearing has failed, and they replace that bearing with an IMS bearing of LN origin or whatever the case may be, and then the car is usually subsequently sold. In that case, they don't have a bearing that hasn't failed to send back into LN to quantify the registration process. So when people are like, hey, why does LN want my old bearing back? I want to keep it. I want to put it on my desk. The reason why that is done is to make sure that somebody did not retrofit an engine with a component that is going to then fail later on down the road or have another bigger failure happen in the engine. The reason why the original bearing has to be sent in is to make sure that said original bearing is not failing or has not failed. If it has been done, then basically at that point it's registered and it's got a huge red flag on it. And then later on down the road, somebody buys the car and Nicole at Ellen Engineering actually sends a letter out to the people who do this. So if she gets a bearing that comes in and that bearing's got a lot of wear, it's like a stage 4 wear, the bearing's loose and flopping around, has lost a lot of metal, or the bearing's completely failed or whatever, she sends a letter. You don't have a warranty at all. This has been flagged in the system because your bearing has failed. Okay. So some people won't send that bearing in and they won't register it because they don't want to tell on themselves, right? Because at the end of the day, these components, none of them were ever designed for repair products. They were designed for elective prophylactic fitment, meaning you fix it before it breaks. Because once it starts to break, it's broken. And there's really no way to keep the secondary collateral damage from said breakage from impacting the rest of the engine globally. It's not going to take out just the new bearing. It's going to score your cylinders up because of debris. It's going to take out the rod and main bearings. It's going to take out other things in the engine, the scavenge pumps, the oil pumps, all that, right? So that's the reason why these things are done. Everything is done for a reason. And time in the trenches has proven to us and proven to Ellen what they need to do with this. But yeah, if you're wanting to buy a car and you're going to do your due diligence and you want to make sure the bearing has been properly retrofitted, get the invoice, okay? Make sure that the shop that did the work replaced other things. Call out or engineering product. Don't say IMS bearing, right? And also make sure that more was done than just resealing the IMS flange, okay? Because there are times where you even have a factory like a dealership invoice that will say IMS removed and replaced. That was usually the flange seal on the IMS flange was leaking, and they replaced it. They didn't change the bearing, right? The factory is not going to change the bearing. The dealer is not going to change the bearing. Although a lot of dealers over time have adopted the Ellen Engineering products at the request of their customers. There's dealers out there. They were some of the last ones to do it that actually adopted my retrofit procedure, and they bought our tools and they bought the products. So dealers have been doing that. There was even one dealer that came out probably right around the time of the class action lawsuit, and they basically sent a postcard out to the people that were on their mailing list that said, if you don't change this bearing, your engine's going to fail, is basically what it said. And that was a dealership. And Charles still has a copy of it. So those are just things that you need to think about as a buyer, is quantify that. Don't just let somebody say, I put a bearing in it, because it could be some copycat bearing. It could be Romanian or Chinese, or it could be something somebody bought off of eBay. It could be a bearing that literally has no way to hold it into the IMS shaft mechanically. It could be glued in with Loctite. There's actually a procedure with one of these copycat places where they glue a bearing in with Loctite. Okay. I mean, really? That is laughable. It is, but it's not. But these are the people that say you don't need to change it again, that you don't need to spend more money for it, blah, blah, blah. So, and a lot of people are watching this are going to be guys that want to buy a car. And, you've got to have a good PPI done. That's another whole segment for another whole night. But an invasive PPI is the way you keep from ripping yourself off. Because if you just go with whatever the seller tells you, there's a good possibility that you are going to rip yourself off, unfortunately.
That's good, Jake. Gone through a lot of stuff.
Yeah. So I think, now let's kind of close it by talking about, who needs to do the work for you. Okay. So let's just put a little bit of a scenario together. Okay. So let's say, Bobby, you've got a 04996. Okay. And you want to have the IMS replaced. That is the 6204 single row bearing. That is single-handedly the absolute worst ball bearing from the factory of all. It is the lightest duty. It has the highest failure rate, and it is the one that the class action lawsuit specifically called out. If you haven't already done that to your car, you are absolutely on borrowed time. And I wouldn't drive the car from here to town 15 miles away without worrying about it if it were my car. And that's just the way that it is, knowing what those can do and how quickly they can do it with no subsequent symptoms or anything else. So you decide that you want to have the work done. Who should do it? Well, unfortunately, to a lot of shops, even though we try to keep this from happening with training and exposure, education, a lot of shops have been treating this IMS bearing retrofit procedure like a brake job, meaning they try to do it as quickly as they can and get the job out the door as quickly as they can. And that is the last guy that you want to do the work. Now, this could be a major problem if you're in a big city that has a lot of Porsches and a lot of Porsche shops. Okay. So let's say you're in San Diego. Porsche shop every couple blocks in some areas. Same thing in San Francisco, even though they're a little more spread out. Same thing in LA. So these shops are all struggling trying to get business. And, a lot of people are looking for the cheapest price to do this. So the shop has to tell the technician, look, you got to get this job done as quick as you can. It's just business. Well, at that point in time, it usually takes about 10 hours, and that's what we've kind of come up with, to do a standard IMS bearing retrofit. Not the solution. The solution takes about another hour. But if you're doing a standard IMS bearing retrofit, not price setting or anything like that, but I'm telling you that about 10 hours is about the norm that you're going to get charged for. So let's say a shop charges $200 an hour. Well, at that point, you're going to end up in a situation where you're going to do a clutch, you're going to do some other things, you're going to roll it all together, and you shouldn't just go do the bearing. You should do other things while you're there, because you're basically getting free labor for those other things. They've already got to have their hands on them. They got to put tools on them. They got to change them. So you may as well do those things while you're there. It's not smart not to. So you go into this thing, and one shop says they'll do it for $1,500. Another shop says they'll do it for $3,000. Another shop says they'll do it for $2,000. If you go to that $1,500 shop, the thing that you have to understand is that guy is going to do that job so fast, he's not going to pre-qualify it, which means he could put your bearing into an engine that's already failing. The pre-qualification procedure is not for the Ellen Engineering bearings life. It's to make sure that you end up with a good return on investment of what you have spent for said bearing with the rest of the engine. So the pre-qualification makes sure that you don't have apparent bore scoring. You don't have chunks of rod bearing in the oil. You don't have a ton of things wrong with this engine that need to be addressed at a higher stake than the IMS bearing. That's the idea. You don't want to have a patient die on the table. So the $1,500 shop is not going to do that. They don't have time. They're trying to make extra money. So that means their technician is out there with a freaking impact wrench. He's jamming everything apart, jamming everything back together. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. He doesn't give a damn. Okay? He can't. And at the end of the day, what you have to understand about the way he's being paid in most circumstances where they pay on flat rate is, let's say the shop charges the customer for 10 hours labor. That's what they've come up with as kind of the go-to figure for it, because it's not a factory protocol. So the labor guy doesn't have an absolute called out time for this repair. Where if you were doing something like a clutch, that pays X amount of hours, no matter how long it takes. So let's say they've used 10 hours as their basic starting point for that, and that's what they're going to charge. That's what they price their $1,500 at. So at that point, if that technician can get your job done in 5 or 6 or 7 hours, he still gets paid for 10. The shop still gets paid for 10. But the thing is, he was able to do it in 7. So now this is how technicians can work a 40-hour physical work week and get paid for 60 or 70 hours of labor. It makes absolutely no sense for this to be paid this way, because it does nothing except for breed neglect and haphazard work. That's all it does. So good shops that want to keep their reputation are not going to charge you that $1,500 for that job, and they're not going to pay their technician on flat rate. They're going to pay their technician per job, and they're going to make sure he does the job to the best of his ability. And if that means if that job should fail pre-qualification, he's going to make it happen, because he doesn't want to have the patient die on the table. It is like my daughter had neurosurgery earlier this week. She had to have a pre-op, right, to make sure that she was good for said surgery. A pre-qualification is a pre-op. Okay. So now, Bobby, I want to go through the last 5 minutes or so here and talk about what happens in a pre-qualification if you choose the wrong shop. So let's say, you've got that same 04996 and you take it to shop, Costa, whatever shop, wherever it may be, and they are going to follow a pre-qualification procedure. At least the owner is going to follow it. Now, he's not a certified installer, but he's done a bunch of these. We hear this all the time. They're not a certified installer, but they've done a bunch of these. Okay, well, that just tells me that maybe they've learned how to cut corners. Sometimes the most amount of experience is not the best thing in the room, because they've learned how to cut corners. They've learned what to do, and they don't lock things down, and you don't want to have your engine be the one that doesn't work out for them. But at any rate, the shop owner has good intentions, and he puts a technician on it. That technician is going to make a chunk of change on his paycheck that week based on the completion of this job for your car. Okay? So let's say that as he starts this, he drains the oil. As he's draining the oil, something falls out in the oil. And all of a sudden, he's like, uh-oh, this engine might have a problem. Then, as he's doing the pre-qualification procedure and he finds some other stuff, he starts thinking, you know what? If I down this job I'm going to lose $1,000 this week or $500 this week or whatever, and I've got to put this thing back together. So at that point, he is put in a really bad spot because his employer, the guy that's his name is on the door, his name is on the front side of the paychecks, that guy has every intention of this job being done right. He puts his technician on it, and the technician is put in a position where either he sees something and he brings it up to the employer, and the employer calls the customer and says, we have disqualified your car because we found a chunk of timing chain in the oil, or whatever the case may be. At that point, he just cost himself $1,000 that week or whatever. And the shop owner cost himself a lot that week because they did the right thing even when nobody was looking. But they're at that point, they've lost all of that, but they've saved their customer. They've saved their customer from spending thousands of dollars on an engine that was currently failing, and they caught it in process. I've had this very thing happen. I've had a car driven to me from Mississippi, and I pull the sump plate off. There's a chunk of timing chain roller. Luckily, the guy was staying 6 miles away overnight for a couple of days for us to do the work. I called him up, Mr. Clark, who is actually a retired Marine recon officer. I said, Mr. Clark, come down here. I want you to see this. I left it all dirty. He shows up, and I said, look, you've driven here, and this is a chunk of your timing chain. You came here from Mississippi, a chunk of your timing chain's in the oil. And I said, this is going to be real freaky, but, you know, you're not going to believe that this happened, and neither am I. Now we've seen this happen more since then. And I said, this is so odd. I want to make sure that this engine didn't have some other failure before you bought the car, and this got left in it. So we pulled off the cam cover. Sure enough, I turned the engine over until I find the timing chain missing the roller, and it was quantified. But if that would have went to another shop, somebody might have just not noticed it. Or maybe they would have noticed it and they didn't do anything about it because they didn't want it to basically reduce the amount of their paycheck that week. This is a huge problem today. And this is why you want to use a certified installer, even if they charge more, because at the end of the day, they're charging you less. It's not an advertisement. It's just common sense. We put together the certified installer program to bring honesty and validity and certified installations along with these things. When I came out with these processes in 2009, when I finally decided to step away from all this, the reason I did it is because I didn't want anybody to put these IMS bearings in and do the work unless they were certified. I didn't want the stuff to go to wholesalers. I didn't want the stuff to get put out on the rest of the market, but the rest of the market wanted it that bad. So I was like, look, I come from an aviation background. I want people to have skin in the game. And I said, if they can't do that, Raby's out. And that's why I did what I did. But at the end of the day, if that would have been done, these shops would have a lot more to lose, and they would have all been trained, and they would have basically had an iron fist keeping them honest and keeping them straight up. So just when you're choosing somebody to do this work, if you go to the cheapest guy, you're going to get every damn thing you pay for. I guarantee it. I swear to you, you will get exactly what you pay for. And if you pay for a headache and you pay for drama and you pay for a half-assed job, then chalk it up. You ripped yourself off. And that's basically the way I have to leave it tonight, Bobby.
That sounds good, Jake. I just want to tell everybody, there's a nice website that Ellen has to kind of help you educate you on the types of bearings. I'll go ahead and pull that up for you. Let's see. Right there it is. You can go to under the products page and go to IMS and bearings, and you can see the dates there are the types of bearings that were used on the Porsche M9X. The one thing that you don't see is the 2006 to 2008, the 6305 single row, which has had very few reports of failure. Jake, did you want to talk about that bearing that was made just for a few years there?
So you're talking about the
6305 and what your
yeah.
position is on that bearing?
So a lot of people, and this is another RennCast, by the way, but I'll touch on it just because people hear IMS bearing, and if they have that 06 or later car, and even some 05s, and I'll touch on the 05s, if you have an 05, I don't care if it's a Boxster, a Cayman. Well, you're not going to have a Cayman in 05 unless it was manufactured in late 05 for an 06 model year. But if you've got a 997.1 base RS, if you've got a Boxster base RS, and it's an 05 model, it can have either the 6204 very problematic bearing, or it can have the 6305 bearing. So in that case, that is the large bearing. Now, this is still very misunderstood about this. You have a small single row bearing, which is the 6204, and then you have that large single row bearing, which is what we call the M97 bearing. And that is what came out in 05. Now, there's directives out there about VIN numbers and engine numbers that have certain bearings in them. I will say this very clearly. If you have a 2005 model year, don't even look at your VIN number. Don't even look at your engine number. Get a bore scope and visually inspect the IMS bearing flange on your engine, because nothing else is accurate. The listings are more inaccurate than they are accurate in this regard. So if it's a 2005, the jury is out until you physically and visually inspect it. Okay. It's easy enough to tell the difference between the two. The early single row bearing has got a 13 millimeter nut that holds the center of the flange. Very small nut. Okay. The later bearing, the M97, is 22 millimeter. It's freaking huge. Okay. So, if you've got a small nut that's like 13 millimeters, hey, that's the early bearing. If it's huge, then that's the later bearing. If it's a huge one, go on about your business. Change the oil and drive the car. Okay. I've only personally seen 3 of those fail. I've probably heard of another 3 and seen pictures of those other 3. But in my facility, and all this time since the beginning, I've only had 3 of those fail. Out of, I'm not going to say thousands, but we've certainly seen in the upper hundreds of regular 6204 bearings fail. So I trust that M97 bearing. Okay. The 05 and later bearing, I trust it if it is the big one. If I do a clutch job on one of those cars, I take a pick and rip the seal off of it and trust that that's going to just go and live a long, long, long time. If I build one of those engines, I'm going to still put my IMS solution in it, because I'm not going to put my name on an engine that has Porsche's bearing in it. I want to get rid of that bearing, period. I want to put the IMS solution in it. But if I'm going to drive that car, just rip the seal off and go on about my business. So that would be your 07 and 08 model year cars in their entirety. It would be your 06 model year cars in their entirety. I have heard of a couple of very early Caymans that had the small bearing, just a couple of them. But as a general rule, all of your Caymans are going to have the bigger bearing. All of your 06, 07, and 08 engines in your 997s, both base and S, your Boxster and your Caymans, base and S, are all going to have that bearing. If you've got it, just going about your business. There's a thing out there where people go in, they bore a hole in the back of the engine and they replace the bearing. That's nonsense. All you're doing is put a lot of debris in the engine that's going to end up grenading everything else. And you're basically putting a bearing in it that's no better than what you had. And in some cases, it's worse. So I would not worry anything about that. I would trust that bearing. They have proven to be robust. They are big enough to carry loads, and they're fine. If you tear the engine down, get rid of it. If you're not tearing it down, don't get rid of it. If you've got any of the other bearings, the 6204 or the early small dual row bearings, they're timed out. Go ahead and replace those, period. And if you've had the job done and you're outside of the 5 years, 50,000, or 6 years, 75,000, or whatever the case may be for whatever bearing you're using, then that bearing's timed out. take the opportunity to cash in some dollars at LN Engineering by sending your old bearing back in that was already a retrofit bearing and putting an IMS solution in it. There's actually a program that is done a few times a year where you're able to do that. It's like an exchange program. So that's kind of my thoughts on it, Bobby.
Sounds good. Well, I think we're about out of time. And I just want to appreciate you, Jake, for talking more about this, because I'm sure a lot of people will be, buying these cars, and they've surprisingly, there's still a lot of folks that don't know about the problem, and now that they're aware. I know I've read several threads where people are saying, I wanted to know everything about the car, and I'm looking to buy one, but I've heard about this problem along with bore
Well,
scoring.
I mean, the
And
thing
what should
is,
I do?
Bobby, I was going to say, a lot of people that have other cars have a timing belt break or a timing chain break, and they don't understand that they had a service interval of 60,000 miles on that timing belt until it broke.
Yeah.
Things have service intervals. And, in today's world, one reason why service intervals don't exist, and let me explain this to you as we close. Around 2000, people stopped buying cars as much and they started leasing them more. Coincidentally enough, that's about the time these water-cooled cars came out. Porsche had never really been able to put their 911s into a leasing program because they required valve adjustments, which is one reason the 993 ended up with hydraulic lifters, which didn't really work that well for many cases. But they always required extra scheduled service. So it made these leasing companies not really favor the cars. So when the water-cooled car came out, it had great creature comforts. And guess what? At that point in time, that's when they said you could go, like in the very beginning, it was something like 2 years or 24,000 miles on an oil change. A lot of these things were done to make the cars more favorable for leasing programs. Okay. So that's not just the case with these cars, but it's just the case with most of these cars. So the factory just didn't want to alarm anybody by saying, hey, you got to change your timing belt, or hey, you've got to change this, you got to change a water pump every 3 years. They didn't do it. We did it because we know when things are breaking, because all we saw for years was broken stuff. And we saw it at the same mileage points. And I had all the trend data. When you can get to the point where somebody calls you up and they're like, I was driving down the road and this happened. And I'm like, sir, stop real quick. I'm going to tell you everything you were getting ready to tell me. When you can do that 3 or 4 times a day because the same stuff is breaking and the symptoms are the same with people all over the country, that's when you know that you've learned something about these engines and you've learned what the inadequacies are. So just because there's not a service interval from the factory does not mean there should not have been a service interval. And it doesn't mean that everything was done to benefit the car. Some things were done to benefit other things, not just the car. Same thing with emissions. Most things with emissions go against the mechanicals of these cars. Cold start values, when these cars first fire up and they advance the cams and they change the ignition timing and they dump fuel in the cylinders to light off those catalytic converters and get that fire going and make sure that you're not going to end up polluting the environment. That may be great for the environment, but it is a negative for the engine. So things that are better for other things are not good for the engine.
All right, Jake. On that note, I want to thank you again for attacking this topic again, and I want to appreciate everyone that follows us on Facebook and YouTube. I really want to encourage you, if you haven't done it, please subscribe. Basically, all that's going to do is just going to notify you when our next videos will hit YouTube. The tentative plan is that we're going to do one of these live videos every Thursday at 8 p.m. I say tentative because that's the plan, okay? But don't hold us to us, okay? But if you have questions, you feel free to ask here on YouTube, or follow us on Facebook. That's one way of doing it too, and we'll try. Honestly, Jake doesn't have time to. I get this question all the time. It says, "Why doesn't Jake answer questions on YouTube?" Because he doesn't freaking have the time. Okay, so don't expect Jake to. I'm being honest. For all the folks who have taken time to ask a question on YouTube, don't. You're better off. You're better off just trying to connect with us on Facebook, through RenVision, and we'll try to get your answer. But we can't guarantee it because we just don't have time to read all through all the comments. So what a lot of people are noticing that our videos do not have comments enabled, and that's the reason, because Jake just doesn't have the time to sit and come through them. Okay. So you guys have a great night, and I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time.